The first hailstone struck Faith's palm as she reached toward the darkening sky, her expression a mixture of wonder and fear. It was 1879 in Wallace Creek, Montana Territory, a place where nature's fury was as unpredictable as the people who dared to settle there. Faith McAllister had never seen hail this size before. It fell like God's own marbles, bouncing off the hard-packed dirt of Main Street as townsfolk scattered for cover. "Get inside, miss," a voice called out, barely audible over the sudden roar of ice pelting the wooden boardwalks and tin roofs. But Faith remained transfixed, watching the storm roll in across the vast Montana plains. The dark clouds had appeared from nowhere, turning a pleasant spring afternoon into something menacing. Another hailstone struck her knuckle, drawing blood, and still she didn't move. "Are you aiming to get yourself killed?" The voice was closer now, a man's voice, rough with concern. A strong hand gripped her elbow, tugging her toward shelter as hailstones began to fall with increasing ferocity. Faith turned, finding herself face to face with a tall, broad-shouldered stranger. His eyes were the color of whiskey in sunlight, his face weathered by years under the western sky. A cowboy, judging by the dust on his boots and the well-worn hat he wore pulled low over his brow. "I've never seen anything like it," she said, finally allowing herself to be pulled toward the overhang of the general store. "Montana hail," he replied, releasing her arm once they were under cover. "It'll bloodier more than your knuckles if you stand out in it." Faith glanced down at her hand, surprised to see several small cuts where the ice had struck her. Blood mingled with melting ice, dripping onto her pale blue dress. "Oh," she whispered, suddenly feeling foolish. The cowboy pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. "You're new here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Arrived on yesterday's stage," Faith confirmed, wrapping the cloth around her hand. "I'm Faith McAllister." "Jake Xavier," he replied with a slight nod. "Most folks just call me Jake." The hail continued to pound around them, some pieces now as large as hens' eggs. The street had cleared entirely, leaving them alone beneath the awning. A particularly strong gust of wind sent hailstones skittering across the boardwalk toward them. "This overhang won't hold if it gets much worse," Jake said, scanning the street. "My ranch is a few miles out. Once this lets up enough, we should make for it." Faith stiffened. "I couldn't possibly, no offense, Miss McAllister, but Wallace Creek ain't exactly prepared for a storm like this. The hotel roof leaks even in a light rain." He gestured to the darkening sky. "This is just getting started." As if to emphasize his point, a large hailstone crashed through the awning above them, followed by several more. Jake instinctively moved closer to Faith, shielding her with his body. "Under my hat," he said suddenly, removing his wide-brimmed Stetson. "It ain't much, but it'll protect your head until we reach my horse." Before Faith could protest, he placed the hat on her head. It was still warm from his own, carrying the scent of sunshine and prairie grass. "We'll make it home," he assured her, his eyes meeting hers with surprising gentleness. "Trust me." Faith hesitated, years of careful upbringing warring with the undeniable danger of their situation. The decision was made for her when a section of the awning collapsed nearby, sending splinters of wood flying. "Lead the way, Mr. Xavier," she said, clutching his handkerchief tighter around her bloodied knuckles. Jake nodded once, then took her elbow again. "Stay close. We run on 3. 1, 2, 3. They dashed into the storm, hailstones pelting them from all sides as they made their way to the hitching post where Jake's horse waited, nervously stamping its hooves. Jake lifted Faith onto the saddle in one swift motion before climbing up behind her. "Hold on tight," he instructed, reaching around her to take the reins. Faith had never been this close to a man who wasn't family. She could feel the solid wall of his chest against her back, the strength in his arms as they encircled her to control the horse. It was improper, scandalous even, and at this moment, absolutely necessary. As they rode out of town, Faith clutched the brim of Jake's hat, keeping it secure against the driving wind. The hailstones continued to fall, striking Jake's shoulders and back, but he didn't flinch or slow their pace. "Not much further," he called over the storm after they'd been riding for what felt like hours but was likely only 20 minutes. "Just beyond that rise." Faith peered through the curtain of hail to see a modest ranch house appear in the distance, smoke curling from its chimney despite the spring weather. A barn stood nearby, and several corrals stretched behind it. It wasn't grand, but it was solid, a home built to withstand the harshness of Montana territory. Jake directed his horse straight to the barn, sliding from the saddle as soon as they were inside, and then helping Faith down. Her legs trembled, partly from the ride and partly from the lingering fear the storm had instilled. "You're safe now," Jake said, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back. "Let me take care of Thunderhead here, then we'll get you into the house." Faith nodded, removing his hat and running a hand through her disheveled hair. Her dress was soaked, her knuckles still stinging where the hailstones had struck them. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier. I don't know what would have happened if Jake," he corrected, leading his horse to a stall. "And you don't need to thank me. Any decent man would have done the same." "Perhaps," Faith replied, watching as he efficiently removed the saddle from his horse. "But I'm not certain any would have done it with such competence." A hint of a smile tugged at the corner of Jake's mouth as he glanced back at her. "Competence, is it? Not a word I hear often in these parts." "I was a schoolteacher back in Boston," Faith explained. "Words are rather important to me." Jake nodded thoughtfully as he brushed down his horse with quick, practiced strokes. "And what brings a Boston schoolteacher to Wallace Creek, Montana, if you don't mind my asking?" Faith hesitated. Her reasons for coming west were complicated, painful even. "I received an offer to teach at the new schoolhouse here," she said, which was true if not the complete truth. "Ah," Jake replied, seeming to sense her reluctance to elaborate. "Well, Wallace Creek could use some education. Lot of children growing up without knowing much beyond ranching and mining." He finished with his horse and turned to face her fully. "Let's get you to the house. My housekeeper, Mrs. Wilkins, can find you some dry clothes." Outside, the hail had subsided somewhat, though rain still fell in heavy sheets. Jake grabbed a canvas slicker from a hook near the barn door, draping it over Faith's shoulders before leading her through the downpour to the ranch house. The interior was simpler than Faith had expected, but clean and well-maintained. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting warm light across the main room with its sturdy furniture and woven rugs. "Mrs. Wilkins," Jake called, helping Faith remove the wet slicker. "We have a visitor." An older woman with silver-streaked dark hair emerged from what Faith presumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of Faith. "Land's sakes, Jake Xavier, you brought a lady home in this storm." "She was caught in town when the hail started," Jake explained. "Miss McAllister, this is Mrs. Wilkins. She keeps this place and me from falling into complete disarray." Mrs. Wilkins approached Faith with maternal concern. "You're soaked through, dear." "And your hand, hailstones," Faith explained, showing the bloodied knuckles that had now stopped bleeding but were beginning to bruise. "Come with me," Mrs. Wilkins said kindly. "I'll find you something dry to wear and see to those cuts." Faith followed the older woman down a hallway to a small bedroom, simply furnished with a bed, dresser, and washstand. This was Mr. Xavier's sister's room before she married and moved to Helena, Mrs. Wilkins explained, rummaging through the dresser. "She was about your size, I think." She produced a simple blue cotton dress and some undergarments. "These should do. I'll prepare a warm wash for your hands while you change." When Mrs. Wilkins had left, Faith peeled off her wet clothing, grateful for the privacy. As she dressed in the borrowed clothes, she wondered about Jake Xavier. He wasn't what she had expected to find in Montana territory. There was a quiet intelligence behind those whiskey-colored eyes, a gentleness that belied his rugged appearance. Mrs. Wilkins returned with a basin of warm water and some salve for Faith's injured hand. "Mr. Xavier said you're the new schoolteacher," she commented as she tended to Faith's wounds. "Yes," Faith replied. "I'm to start next week once the schoolhouse preparations are complete." "It'll be good for the children," Mrs. Wilkins nodded. "Too many of them running wild, especially since—" She trailed off, pressing her lips together as if she'd said too much. "Since what?" Faith prompted. Mrs. Wilkins sighed. "Since the trouble at the mine last year. A lot of children lost their fathers. Some families moved away, but others stayed on, mothers trying to make ends meet however they can." Faith's heart constricted. She knew about the mine collapse. It had been reported in newspapers as far east as Boston, but she hadn't realized the full impact on the community she was joining. "I see," she said softly. "All the more reason for a proper education, then." Mrs. Wilkins patted her hand gently. "That's the spirit, dear. Now, let's get you something to eat. The storm doesn't look to be letting up any time soon, so I expect you'll be our guest for dinner at least." In the main room, Jake had changed into dry clothes as well and was building up the fire. He turned as Faith entered, his expression warming at the sight of her in his sister's dress. "Feeling better?" he asked. Faith nodded, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. "Much, thank you. Mrs. Wilkins has been very kind." "She has that way about her," Jake agreed with a fond glance toward the housekeeper, who was already bustling back to the kitchen. "Please sit down. The fire will help with any chill." Faith settled into a chair near the hearth, extending her hands toward the warmth. Jake remained standing, seemingly unsure of himself now that the immediate crisis had passed. "I should apologize," he said finally. "It wasn't proper to bring you here, a single woman to a bachelor's home, but I couldn't think of a safer alternative with that storm." "There's nothing to apologize for," Faith assured him. "You saved me from injury, perhaps worse, and Mrs. Wilkins's presence makes everything quite proper." Jake relaxed slightly, taking a seat in the chair opposite her. "So, a schoolteacher from Boston," he mused. "That's quite a journey to make alone." "I've always been independent," Faith replied. "Perhaps too much so, according to my family." "They didn't approve of you coming west," Faith smiled ruefully. "My father thought it tantamount to suicide. My mother was convinced I'd be ravished by savages within a week." She blushed at her own frankness. "Forgive me, that was indelicate." To her surprise, Jake laughed, a warm, genuine sound that transformed his face. "No need for forgiveness. It's refreshing to hear someone speak plainly." His expression grew more serious. "Though I hope you understand that most of the native peoples around here just want to be left in peace. The real danger comes from men who look like me, but have lost their humanity to greed or liquor." Faith studied him, intrigued by his perspective. Most men of her acquaintance would have readily agreed with her mother's prejudices. "You seem to know the native peoples well." "I trade with the Crow regularly," Jake explained. "Good people. Taught me how to survive my first Montana winter when I came out here 15 years ago. 15 years. You must have been quite young." 19, Jake confirmed. "Came west after the war with nothing but a restless spirit and skills that didn't fit peacetime." Faith did the calculation quickly. That would make him 34 now, 12 years her senior, but not so great a gap as to be remarkable. "And you built all this yourself?" she asked, gesturing to the ranch around them. Pride flickered across Jake's features. "Started with 10 acres and a one-room cabin. Now it's 2,000 acres and 20 head of cattle. Not the biggest spread, but it's mine, free and clear." "That's impressive," Faith said sincerely. "To build something from nothing takes real fortitude." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Wilkins announcing dinner. The meal was simple but hearty: venison stew, fresh bread, and apple preserves, and the conversation flowed easily between the three of them. Faith found herself laughing more than she had in months, perhaps years. As Mrs. Wilkins cleared the dishes, Jake stood and walked to the window. "Storm's letting up," he observed, "but it's full dark now. Miss McAllister, I'm afraid you'll have to stay the night. Mrs. Wilkins has prepared my sister's room for you." Faith knew she should protest, should insist on returning to town despite the hour, but the thought of riding through the wet, dark night was far less appealing than remaining in this warm, comfortable home. "If it's truly not an imposition," she said carefully. "Not at all," Jake assured her. "I'll take you back to town first thing in the morning." Mrs. Wilkins nodded approvingly. "It's settled then. I've laid out a nightgown and some toiletries for you, Miss McAllister." Later, as Faith prepared for bed in the small, neat room, she found herself reflecting on the unexpected turn her day had taken. She had arrived in Wallace Creek with specific intentions, a plan for her future that certainly didn't include being rescued by a handsome rancher during a hailstorm. And yet, as she climbed into the unfamiliar bed, Faith couldn't help feeling that perhaps fate had intervened in her carefully laid plans. With that unsettling thought, she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning came with brilliant sunshine that belied the previous day's violence. Faith woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of activity in the kitchen. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now dried by Mrs. Wilkins's careful attention, and made her way to the main room. Jake was already at the table, reading a newspaper as Mrs. Wilkins served breakfast. He stood when Faith entered, his manners impeccable despite the informal setting. "Good morning," he greeted her. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you," Faith replied, taking the seat he offered. Breakfast was a quiet affair, with Jake occasionally commenting on news items from the week-old newspaper. Faith learned that he made the trip into Wallace Creek only every couple of weeks for supplies and mail, preferring the solitude of his ranch to town life. "Though I might make an exception now that we have a proper schoolteacher," he added with a slight smile that caused Faith's heart to beat a little faster. After the meal, Jake hitched his wagon while Faith gathered her few belongings and thanked Mrs. Wilkins for her hospitality. "You're welcome back any time, dear," the housekeeper said warmly. "It's been too long since this house had a young woman's presence." The ride back to town was pleasant, the morning sun drying the muddy roads as they traveled. Faith found herself stealing glances at Jake's profile as he handled the team of horses with easy confidence. "Will you attend the town social next Saturday?" she asked impulsively. "I understand it's being held to welcome me officially to Wallace Creek." Jake hesitated. "I'm not much for town gatherings," he admitted, "but for a proper welcome." He glanced at her with that same slight smile. "Perhaps I could make another exception." Faith felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. "I would appreciate a friendly face," she said. "Everything and everyone is still so new to me." "Then I'll be there," he promised as they reached the edge of town. Wallace Creek looked different in the clear light of morning, smaller somehow, but also more alive than it had seemed when Faith had arrived by stagecoach 2 days earlier. People were out repairing damage from the storm, nodding greetings to Jake as he drove the wagon down Main Street. "Where can I take you?" he asked. "The hotel." Faith hesitated. She hadn't told him the complete truth about her situation. "Actually, the schoolhouse has living quarters attached. I'll be staying there." Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't question her further, directing the wagon toward the small white building at the far end of town. It was in need of paint and minor repairs, but solidly built with a separate entrance for what would be Faith's living space. "It's not much," Jake commented as he helped her down from the wagon. "It's more than enough," Faith assured him. "I've always believed home is what you make of it." Jake studied her face for a moment as if trying to read something beneath her words. "A wise philosophy," he said finally. "Well, Miss McAllister, it seems you've survived your first Montana hailstorm and lived to tell the tale." Faith smiled up at him, suddenly reluctant to say goodbye. "Thanks to you, Mr. Xavier." "Jake," he reminded her gently. "Jake," she repeated, the name feeling somehow intimate on her lips. "And you must call me Faith." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Faith," he said, the single syllable carrying a weight of meaning neither of them was ready to acknowledge. "Until Saturday, then." As his wagon pulled away, Faith watched until it disappeared around a bend in the road, her bloodied knuckles now merely tender reminders of the storm that had brought Jake Xavier into her life. The week passed in a flurry of activity as Faith prepared the schoolhouse for classes. The town chairman, Mr. Peterson, had given her a tour on her first full day, explaining the history of the building and introducing her to several prominent citizens. "The school's been closed for nearly a year," he explained, "since Miss Thornton left to get married. We've been making do with Mrs. Peterson teaching the younger ones in our parlor, but it's not ideal." Faith surveyed the single room with its rows of desks, blackboard, and small bookshelf containing perhaps 20 worn volumes. "I'll need more books," she observed, "and maps if possible." "We've set aside some funds," Mr. Peterson assured her. "Not a fortune, mind you, but enough to get started." By Friday, Faith had cleaned every surface, arranged the desks in a more practical configuration, and created a tentative curriculum based on the ages and abilities of the children she would be teaching. According to the town registry, there would be 18 pupils, ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. Her living quarters were Spartan but sufficient: a bedroom, small sitting room, and kitchen with a hand pump for water. The outhouse was behind the building, and she had access to the bathhouse in town once a week. It was far from the comforts of Boston, but Faith found herself enjoying the simplicity. She had seen nothing of Jake Xavier since he dropped her off, though she'd heard his name mentioned occasionally in town. The general store owner, Mr. Collins, had commented that Jake was a good man, if a bit of a loner, while Mrs. Peterson had hinted that several of the town's eligible women had set their caps for the rancher without success. "Not that he's unfriendly," Mrs. Peterson had said as she helped Faith select fabric for classroom curtains. "Just particular. Lost his wife and child to fever 10 years back. Some say he never got over it." The revelation had surprised Faith, though it explained something of the sadness she'd glimpsed behind Jake's eyes. She found herself thinking of him often as she worked, wondering what he was doing at his ranch, if he thought of her at all. Saturday dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for the social that would be held in the town square that evening. Faith spent extra time on her appearance, pinning her chestnut hair in a style that was neat but not severe, and choosing her best dress, a forest green that complemented her eyes. The social began at sundown, with lanterns strung across the square and tables laden with food prepared by the women of Wallace Creek. A small band played lively tunes, and children darted between the adults, enjoying the rare festivity. Faith was introduced to dozens of people, names and faces blurring together as she smiled and nodded and tried to remember which children belonged to which parents. Everyone was welcoming, if somewhat reserved, clearly taking her measure before fully accepting her into their community. As the evening progressed, Faith found herself repeatedly glancing toward the edge of the gathering, hoping to see Jake's tall figure approaching. But as the hours passed with no sign of him, disappointment settled heavy in her chest. "He doesn't come to these things," a voice said beside her, and Faith turned to find a young woman watching her with knowing eyes. "Jake Xavier, I mean. That's who you're looking for, isn't it?" Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm simply taking in the whole gathering," she said diplomatically. The woman laughed, a pleasant sound without malice. "I'm Charlotte Reed. My husband, Thomas, runs the livery, and you needn't be embarrassed. Half the women in town have waited for Jake at one event or another." "He did say he might come tonight," Faith admitted, "but perhaps he changed his mind." Charlotte shook her head. "If Jake said he'd be here, he will. He's a man of his word." She glanced past Faith, her expression brightening. "See, what did I tell you?" Faith turned to see Jake entering the square, looking somewhat uncomfortable in clean trousers and a pressed shirt, his hat held awkwardly in his hands. Their eyes met across the gathering, and for a moment, it seemed to Faith that everyone else faded away. Jake made his way toward her, nodding greetings to those he passed but never breaking eye contact with Faith. When he reached her, he offered a small, almost shy smile. "Miss McAllister," he said formally, "you look lovely this evening." "Thank you," Faith replied, suddenly aware of Charlotte watching them with undisguised interest. "You remember our agreement, though it's Faith." Jake's smile widened slightly. "Faith," he amended, "I hope I'm not too late for your official welcome." "Not at all," she assured him. "Though I've met so many people, I doubt I'll remember half their names by Monday." "You'll learn them soon enough," Jake said. "Especially once you start teaching their children." Speaking of which, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "A small gift for your schoolhouse." Faith accepted it with surprise, carefully unwrapping the paper to reveal a beautifully crafted wooden whistle. "It's lovely," she said, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "Crow design," Jake explained, "for calling the children in from play. It can be heard for quite a distance." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Faith deeply. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll use it every day." Their moment was interrupted by Mr. Peterson calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's officially welcome our new schoolteacher, Miss Faith McAllister, to Wallace Creek." There was a round of applause as Faith was ushered forward to say a few words. She spoke briefly about her excitement to begin teaching and her hope to become a valued member of the community. As the band struck up another tune, Faith found herself back at Jake's side. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, extending his hand. Faith hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. "I'd be delighted." Jake led her to where other couples were already dancing, his hand respectfully at her waist as they joined the simple pattern. He moved with unexpected grace for such a tall man, guiding her through the steps with confidence. "You dance well," Faith observed as they turned together. "My mother insisted all her children learn," Jake replied, "said it was a necessary social skill even out west." "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Jake said, a shadow crossing his features. "She passed on 5 years ago, pneumonia." Faith squeezed his hand gently. "I'm sorry for your loss." Jake nodded in acknowledgement, then deliberately lightened his tone. "Mrs. Peterson tells me you've been working wonders with the schoolhouse." "Hardly wonders," Faith laughed. "Just a good cleaning and some organization. The children deserve a pleasant place to learn." "And when do they start?" "Monday morning," Faith said. I'll admit to some nervousness. It's been a while since I taught a classroom full of children. Jake's expression turned curious. How long? Faith hesitated, then decided on honesty. 2 years I've been occupied with other matters. Family responsibilities, Jake guessed. Something like that, Faith replied, not quite meeting his eyes. The music ended before Jake could pursue the question further, and they were soon separated by well-meaning townsfolk eager to introduce Faith to still more people she was unlikely to remember. Throughout the evening, though, Faith found her gaze repeatedly drawn to Jake, who remained somewhat apart from the main festivities, occasionally engaging in conversation but mostly observing. Several times she caught him watching her, his expression thoughtful. As the social began to wind down, Jake approached her again. "May I walk you home?" he asked quietly. Faith nodded, retrieving her shawl from a nearby bench. They said their good nights to those still gathered, then set off toward the schoolhouse, the spring night cool but pleasant around them. "Did you enjoy yourself?" Faith asked as they walked. "More than I expected to," Jake admitted. "It's been a long time since I attended anything like that." "Because of your wife?" The question slipped out before Faith could consider its propriety. Jake stopped walking, surprise evident in his face. "You know about Sarah?" Faith felt immediately contrite. "Mrs. Peterson mentioned your loss. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "No, it's all right," Jake said, resuming their pace. "Sarah died 10 years ago. Her and our son, James. He was barely 2. "That's terrible," Faith said softly, her heart aching for the pain she heard in his voice. Jake was quiet for several steps. "For a long time I couldn't bear to be around people. Their happiness felt like an insult to my grief." He glanced at Faith. "That probably sounds selfish." "Not at all," Faith assured him. "Grief changes us. It can make the simplest things unbearable." Something in her tone made Jake study her more closely. "You speak as if from experience." Faith wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "My fiancé died 3 years ago, typhoid fever." She rarely spoke of Christopher, finding most people uncomfortable with her continued sorrow. "We were to be married that spring." "I'm sorry," Jake said with genuine empathy. "Was that why you left Boston?" They had reached the schoolhouse, but Faith wasn't ready to end their conversation. "Would you like some tea?" she offered instead of answering. "It's not very late." Jake seemed to understand her reluctance to part. "Tea would be nice," he said, following her to the separate entrance of her living quarters. Faith busied herself with the kettle while Jake looked around the small space with interest. She had added a few personal touches, a crocheted throw over the single armchair, a vase of wildflowers on the table, books stacked neatly on every available surface. "You've made it homey already," Jake observed, picking up a volume of poetry from a side table. "Tennyson, a favorite of mine," Faith said, surprised by his recognition of the author. "Do you read poetry?" Jake smiled slightly. "Would it shock you to know this uncouth rancher has an appreciation for literature?" "Not shocked," Faith replied, setting out cups and saucers. "Pleasantly surprised, perhaps." When the tea was ready, they sat across from each other at the small table, the lamp between them casting a warm glow that made the moment feel intimate, almost suspended in time. "You asked if Christopher's death was why I left Boston," Faith said, returning to their earlier conversation. "It was part of the reason, but not all of it." Jake waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "After he died, I continued teaching, but something had changed," Faith explained, staring into her tea. "Boston held too many memories, too many plans we'd made together. And then there was the pressure from my family to move on, to accept one of the suitors they deemed appropriate." She looked up at Jake. "When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Montana Territory, it seemed like an escape." "And is that how you still see it? As an escape?" Faith considered the question, surprised by its insight. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "When I arrived, perhaps. But now I think it might be something else. A beginning, maybe," Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Beginnings can be hard to recognize when you're still carrying the weight of endings." "Is that why you've remained alone?" Faith asked gently. "Because you're still carrying Sarah and James?" "For a long time, yes," Jake acknowledged. "But lately—" He trailed off, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Lately, I've been wondering if it might be possible to honor their memory while still allowing myself to feel something new." The air between them seemed charged with possibility. Faith was acutely aware of how improper it was to be alone with him like this, yet she couldn't bring herself to end the moment. Jake set down his teacup and reached across the table, his fingers lightly brushing the back of her hand where the hailstone cuts were healing. "Strange, isn't it? How a storm can change everything." Faith nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. His touch sent warmth spreading through her, a sensation both frightening and exhilarating. A clock somewhere in town struck 10, breaking the spell between them. Jake withdrew his hand and stood. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "You have a big day on Monday." Faith rose as well, walking him to the door. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said. "And for the whistle, it was very thoughtful." Jake paused at the threshold, looking down at her with an expression that made Faith's breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and was surprised by how desperately she wanted him to. Instead, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles where the hailstones had bloodied them. "Good night, Faith," he said softly. "I'll see you soon." As Faith closed the door behind him, she leaned against it, her hand still tingling from the touch of his lips. This was dangerous territory. She knew to feel such a strong connection to a man she barely knew. And yet, there was something between them that transcended time or logic, a recognition that felt almost like coming home. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect for the first day of school. Faith rose early, dressed in her most professional attire, and made sure everything was ready for her students' arrival. At precisely 8 o'clock, she stood on the schoolhouse steps and blew Jake's whistle, its clear tone carrying across the town. Children appeared from all directions, some running eagerly, others dawdling, all eyeing her with curiosity as they filed into the building. Faith greeted each one by name, having memorized the town registry, and directed them to seats appropriate for their ages. The day passed in a blur of introductions, assessments, and establishing rules. By afternoon, Faith was exhausted but exhilarated. These children were bright and eager to learn, despite the gaps in their education during the school's closure. As she dismissed them at 3 o'clock, Faith noticed a tall figure leaning against a tree across from the schoolhouse. Jake raised a hand in greeting as the last child departed, then crossed to where she stood. "How was your first day, Miss McAllister?" he asked, his eyes warm with interest. Faith couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. "Challenging, rewarding, exactly what I hoped for." "The children seemed animated as they left," Jake observed. "A good sign, I'd say." "I hope so," Faith replied. "Though I've already identified several areas where they'll need significant help. Mr. Peterson was right to worry about their education suffering during the school's closure." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "I might have some books at the ranch that could be useful. Old textbooks my sister used and some novels suitable for the older children." "That would be wonderful," Faith said gratefully. "The library is rather limited at present." "I'll bring them by later this week," Jake promised. He hesitated, then added, "I was wondering if you might join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant tomorrow evening to celebrate your successful first week of teaching. Faith felt a flutter of anticipation in her stomach. Tomorrow is only Tuesday, she pointed out with a smile. Then we'll be celebrating your successful first 2 days, Jake amended, returning her smile. And perhaps discussing those areas where the children need help. A professional consultation, if you will. They both knew it was more than that, but the pretense gave Faith the propriety she needed to accept. In that case, I'd be delighted. A professional consultation sounds very responsible. Jake's smile widened. I'll call for you at 6 then. True to his word, Jake arrived at precisely 6 o'clock the following evening. Faith had changed from her teaching clothes into a simple but elegant blue dress that brought out the green in her eyes. Jake, too, had made an effort, wearing a clean white shirt and dark jacket that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. "You look beautiful," he said simply as she opened the door. Faith felt herself blush at the direct compliment. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Wallace Creek, which wasn't saying much by Boston standards, but represented genuine luxury for the frontier town. White cloths covered the tables, and actual wine glasses accompanied the place settings. They were seated at a corner table, somewhat removed from the other diners, though Faith was keenly aware of the curious glances sent their way. By now, everyone in town knew of her dramatic rescue during the hailstorm, and Jake's appearance at the social had sparked inevitable gossip. "I hope this isn't causing too much talk," Faith said quietly after they had ordered. Jake followed her gaze to where Mrs. Peterson was whispering to another woman, both occasionally glancing in their direction. "Small towns run on gossip," he said with a shrug. "But I've never much cared what others think." "A luxury not afforded to schoolteachers," Faith pointed out. "I'm expected to be above reproach." "Is dining with a respectable rancher cause for reproach?" Jake asked, though his tone suggested he understood her concern. "Of course not," Faith assured him. "It's just that in a position like mine, appearances matter perhaps more than they should." Their conversation shifted to safer topics as the food arrived, the progress of her students, the books Jake planned to donate, the changing spring weather. Yet beneath the ordinary words ran a current of connection that neither could deny. As they finished their meal, Jake grew more serious. "Faith, there's something I should tell you," he said, his voice low. "Something about the mine disaster last year." Faith looked at him in surprise. "What about it?" Jake glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "The official story is that it was an accident. Supports gave way in the main shaft, trapping 27 men." "Yes, I read about it in the newspaper," Faith nodded. 12 men died, as I recall." 15, Jake corrected grimly. "And it wasn't an accident. The mining company had been warned repeatedly about unsafe conditions. The foreman documented it all, sent reports to the owners in San Francisco." Faith leaned forward, concerned by the intensity in his voice. "How do you know this?" "Because I was there when they brought the bodies out," Jake said, his jaw tightening at the memory. "And because the foreman, Martin Coleman, was my friend. He showed me copies of those reports the week before the collapse." "What happened to him? To Martin?" "He was one of the 15, Jake replied. "And all his documentation disappeared after his death. The company called it a tragic accident, paid minimal compensation to the widows, and reopened within 2 months with new workers." Faith absorbed this information, troubled by its implications. "Why are you telling me this?" Jake met her gaze directly. "Because 3 of your students lost their fathers in that collapse, and because the mine owner's son, Charles Blackwood, sits on the town council that hired you." "Mr. Peterson never mentioned he wouldn't," Jake interrupted. "The Blackwoods essentially own this town. The mine provides most of the employment, and Charles makes sure everyone remembers it. Faith considered this new information carefully. Do you think my position is somehow connected to this? I don't know, Jake admitted. But I wanted you to understand the undercurrents here. Wallace Creek isn't as simple as it appears. Few places are, Faith said thoughtfully. Thank you for telling me. Their walk back to the schoolhouse was quieter, both preoccupied with thoughts they weren't ready to share. At Faith's door, Jake took her hand, his thumb gently tracing the now healed marks where the hailstones had struck. I didn't mean to burden you with Wallace Creek's darker side, he said apologetically. Faith shook her head. It's not a burden to know the truth. Especially when it affects my students. Jake's expression softened as he looked down at her. You're remarkable, Faith McAllister, he said quietly. Most people would be reconsidering their decision to stay. I'm not most people, Faith replied with a small smile. And I've never been one to run from difficulty. No, Jake agreed, his voice warm with admiration. I don't imagine you are. This time when he leaned toward her, Faith knew he would kiss her. His lips were gentle against hers, the contact brief but filled with promise. When he pulled away, his eyes were dark with emotions that mirrored her own. Good night, Faith, he said softly. Good night, Jake, she whispered, reluctantly releasing his hand and stepping inside. As spring turned to summer, Faith fell into a comfortable routine in Wallace Creek. Her days were filled with teaching, her evenings often spent in Jake's company. They were careful to maintain propriety, dining at the hotel restaurant, walking in public places, occasionally joined by Mrs. Wilkins when Faith visited the ranch on Sundays. Yet despite their caution, Faith was aware of growing tensions in the town. Charles Blackwood had begun to take a particular interest in her, appearing at school functions and offering donations of expensive books and equipment that Faith found difficult to refuse for her students' sake. He's marking his territory, Jake said bluntly one evening as they sat on the schoolhouse steps, watching the sunset. Making sure everyone knows he could provide for you better than I can. That's ridiculous, Faith protested. I'm not some prize to be won. Jake gave her a sideways glance, his expression troubled. To men like Blackwood, everything and everyone has a price. He's not used to being denied. Faith reached for Jake's hand, threading her fingers through his. Then he'll have to get used to it, she said firmly. My affections aren't for sale. Jake brought their joined hands to his lips. I know that, he said quietly. But Blackwood plays by different rules. Just be careful around him. Faith nodded, though she privately thought Jake might be overreacting. Charles Blackwood had always been perfectly cordial to her, if a bit presumptuous in his attention. The confrontation came sooner than either of them expected. The following week, as Faith was preparing to close the schoolhouse for the day, Charles appeared in the doorway, his expensive suit out of place in the simple classroom. Miss McAllister, he greeted her with a practiced smile. I hope I'm not interrupting. Faith straightened from where she'd been erasing the blackboard. Mr. Blackwood, the children have already been dismissed. Good, he said, stepping further into the room. That gives us an opportunity to speak privately. Something in his tone put Faith immediately on guard. What can I help you with? Charles moved to one of the student desks, running a finger along its surface as if checking for dust. I've been meaning to discuss your association with Jake Xavier. Faith stiffened. I wasn't aware my personal associations were subject to discussion, Mr. Blackwood. When they affect the reputation of our school, they become a matter of public interest, Charles replied smoothly. Several parents have expressed concern about the example being set. What example would that be? Faith asked, her voice cooling. A single woman frequently seen in the company of a man known for his unconventional views, Charles said. particularly his sympathies toward the native population and his criticism of legitimate business interests. Faith set down the eraser with deliberate care. Mr. Xavier has been nothing but respectful in his conduct toward me, and his views on fair treatment of all people speak well of his character, not poorly. Charles's expression hardened slightly. Miss McAllister, let me be direct. Your position here depends on the goodwill of the town council, which I happen to chair. It would be a shame if that goodwill were to evaporate due to an ill-considered attachment. Are you threatening my employment because I choose to associate with Mr. Xavier? Faith asked incredulously. Not at all, Charles said, his smile returning though it didn't reach his eyes. I'm merely advising caution. Wallace Creek needs a teacher above reproach, one who understands where the town's best interests lie. Faith felt anger rising in her chest. I believe the town's best interests lie in honest education and moral integrity, Mr. Blackwood. Those are values I share with Mr. Xavier. Charles studied her for a moment, then shrugged elegantly. I see Xavier has already poisoned your mind against me. A pity. I had hoped we might reach an understanding. The only understanding I need is that I am free to associate with whomever I choose in my personal time, Faith said firmly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have lessons to prepare. Charles moved toward the door but paused before exiting. Consider carefully, Miss McAllister. Some choices have consequences that reach further than we anticipate. With that cryptic warning, he departed, leaving Faith trembling with indignation. She debated whether to tell Jake about the encounter, knowing it would only increase the tension between the two men. In the end, honesty won out. When Jake arrived the following evening to accompany her to a church social, she recounted the conversation in full. Jake's reaction was as explosive as she'd feared. The nerve of that entitled, he cut himself off, visibly struggling to control his anger. I'm sorry, Faith. This is exactly what I was worried about. It's not your fault, Faith assured him, placing a calming hand on his arm. Charles Blackwood doesn't own this town, whatever he may think. No, but he has influence, Jake said grimly, and he's not above using it to get what he wants. Faith lifted her chin defiantly. Then he'll discover I'm not as easily intimidated as he expects. Jake's expression softened as he looked down at her. Your courage is one of the many things I love about you, he said, then froze as he realized what he'd admitted. Faith felt her heart skip a beat. Jake? He took her hands in his eyes serious as they met hers. I didn't plan to say that yet, but it's true. I love you, Faith. I have since that day in the hailstorm when you stood there with bloody knuckles, more fascinated than afraid. I love you too, Faith whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and absolutely right. I think I have since you put your hat on my head and promised we'd make it home. Jake drew her into his arms, his kiss deeper and more passionate than the careful ones they'd shared before. Faith returned it without reservation, her arms sliding around his neck as she pressed closer. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Jake rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said softly. Not because of Blackwood or what anyone else thinks, but because I want to build a life with you, Faith McAllister. Faith pulled back slightly to search his face, finding nothing but sincerity and love in his expression. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you, Jake Xavier. His smile was radiant as he pulled her close again, spinning her around in a moment of pure joy before setting her carefully on her feet. We should wait until the school term ends, he said practically. That's only 6 weeks away. No one can object to you continuing to teach until then. Faith nodded her agreement, though she suspected Charles Blackwood would find plenty to object to, regardless of timing. 6 weeks, she repeated, and then we'll begin our life together. News of their engagement spread quickly through Wallace Creek, met with varying reactions. Most of the townspeople offered sincere congratulations, having watched the romance develop with neighborly interest. Mrs. Wilkins was especially delighted, embracing Faith warmly when she visited the ranch that Sunday. "I've been praying for this day for months," the older woman confessed, happy tears in her eyes. "Jake deserves happiness, and you're exactly what he needs." Not everyone was as supportive. Charles Blackwood made his disapproval clear by abruptly withdrawing his donations to the school and suggesting at the next town council meeting that perhaps Faith's contract need not be renewed for the fall term. "After all," he said smoothly, "a married woman has responsibilities to her husband. Teaching would surely be a burden." To Faith's surprise, it was Mr. Peterson who spoke up in her defense. "Miss McAllister, soon to be Mrs. Xavier, has proven herself an exceptional educator. If she wishes to continue teaching after her marriage, I see no reason to deny our children her expertise." The matter was put to a vote, with the council voting 3-2 in favor of offering Faith a new contract, much to Charles's visible annoyance. Faith accepted graciously, privately amused by the assumption that she netted their permission to continue teaching once she was married to Jake, who fully supported her career. As the end of the school term approached, Faith divided her time between her teaching duties and preparations for the wedding. It would be a simple ceremony at the town church, followed by a celebration at Jake's ranch, their ranch, as he now insisted on calling it. 2 weeks before the wedding, Faith was walking home from school when she noticed a commotion near the mine entrance. A crowd had gathered, and there was shouting and the sound of horses being urged to speed. Her heart sank as she recognized the signs of another accident. Hurrying toward the scene, Faith was stopped by Mrs. Reid, who gripped her arm with unusual force. "Don't go any closer, Faith," she warned, her face pale. "There's been a cave-in. Is anyone hurt?" Faith asked, scanning the crowd for familiar faces, mentally counting which of her students had fathers who worked the mine. "We don't know yet," Charlotte replied grimly. "They're bringing men out now." Before Faith could respond, she heard her name being called and turned to see Jake riding hard toward her, his expression tight with concern. "Faith," he called again as he reached her, swinging down from his horse in one fluid motion. "Thank God you're safe." "Of course I'm safe," Faith said, confused by his intensity. "I was at the schoolhouse all day. What's happening?" Jake glanced toward the mine entrance where men were emerging covered in coal dust, some supporting injured comrades. "Another collapse," he said grimly. "Third section this time." Faith felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "Was anyone killed?" "2 confirmed so far," Jake said, his voice hard with suppressed anger, "and 4 still unaccounted for." "How did you hear about it so quickly?" Faith asked, noticing that Jake himself was unusually dusty, as if he'd been riding hard. A shadow crossed his face. "I was meeting with some of the miners at the Elkhorn Saloon. They've been documenting safety violations, just like Martin did." He ran a hand through his hair, leaving a smudge of dirt on his forehead. "I rode out to the ranch to get the papers Martin gave me before he died, then came looking for you." Faith's eyes widened. "You kept them. After all this time?" "I kept copies," Jake corrected. "Didn't trust anyone else with them after what happened to Martin, but now with more evidence." He trailed off, looking back toward the mine. Understanding dawned on Faith. "You're going to expose the Blackwoods." Jake nodded grimly. "It's time someone did. Too many men have died because of their greed." He took her hands, his expression earnest. "Faith, this could get ugly. Charles won't take this lightly. If you want to delay the wedding, I'd understand." Faith squeezed his hands firmly. "We are not delaying anything," she said with quiet determination. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Relief and love flooded Jake's face. "Have I told you today how remarkable you are?" "Not yet," Faith smiled. "But we have more important matters to attend to right now." "What can I do to help?" Over the next few days, Wallace Creek was a town divided. As the full extent of the mine owner's negligence became clear, many citizens, particularly those with family members who worked in the mine, rallied behind Jake's efforts to hold the Blackwoods accountable. Others, dependent on the mine for their livelihoods, feared what would happen if the operation were shut down or ownership changed hands. Faith found herself in a delicate position. As the town's schoolteacher, she needed to remain somewhat neutral for the sake of her students. Yet as Jake's fiancée, her loyalty was unquestionable. She navigated the situation by focusing on the welfare of those affected by the accident, organizing relief efforts for the families of the injured and dead miners. Charles Blackwood, meanwhile, had gone on the offensive. He publicly accused Jake of stirring up trouble to advance his own interests, suggesting that Jake wanted the mine for himself or was in league with outside investors looking to take over. Ridiculous, Jake scoffed when he heard the allegations. "Anyone who knows me knows I want nothing to do with mining." But the rumors persisted, and the tension in town grew palpable. Faith began to notice parents from certain families, those aligned with the Blackwoods, keeping their distance from her, though thankfully none withdrew their children from school. The confrontation Faith had been dreading came 3 days before the wedding. She was alone in the schoolhouse, gathering her personal belongings now that the term had ended, when Charles Blackwood appeared in the doorway for the second time. "Miss McAllister," he greeted her coldly. "Or should I say the future Mrs. Xavier?" Faith straightened, refusing to be intimidated. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm rather busy at the moment." "This won't take long," he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him, a move that immediately set Faith on edge. "I've come to offer you one last opportunity to reconsider your position." "My position regarding what exactly?" Faith asked, though she knew perfectly well what he meant. Charles approached until he stood on the opposite side of her desk. "Your engagement to a man who is actively trying to destroy this town's primary industry. A man who consorts with natives and radicals. A man beneath your education and breeding." Faith felt anger rise in her chest. "Mr. Blackwood, I will not dignify those accusations with a response, except to say that Jake Xavier is the finest man I have ever known, and I consider myself fortunate to be marrying him." Charles's expression hardened. "Then you leave me no choice but to inform the town council of certain information I've recently received about your past in Boston." Faith felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you talking about?" A triumphant smile spread across Charles's features. "Did you think no one would discover the truth? That your fiancé wasn't simply a casualty of typhoid, but took his own life after you broke your engagement? That the real reason you fled Boston was the scandal that followed?" Faith gripped the edge of her desk to steady herself. "That's not. You don't understand what happened." "I understand enough," Charles said coldly. "Imagine how the good people of Wallace Creek will react when they learn their children's teacher drove a man to suicide and then lied about it." "I never lied," Faith whispered, her voice trembling. "Christopher did die of typhoid. That he chose to expose himself to the disease after our engagement ended was not something I could have prevented." "A convenient interpretation," Charles sneered, "but not how it was viewed in Boston society, according to my sources." Faith took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze steadily. "What do you want, Mr. Blackwood? It's simple. Convince Xavier to withdraw his accusations and destroy whatever so-called evidence he claims to have, End your engagement and leave Wallace Creek. He leaned forward slightly. Do that, and your secret remains safe. Refuse, and by this time tomorrow, everyone will know exactly what kind of woman you really are. Faith felt a strange calm settle over her as she regarded the man before her. You genuinely believe I would betray Jake to protect my reputation? I believe you're an intelligent woman who understands the value of self-preservation, Charles replied. Think carefully, Miss McAllister. I'll expect your answer by noon tomorrow. With a final smirk, he turned and left the schoolhouse. Faith sank into her chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The past she had tried so hard to leave behind had found her, twisted and distorted by Charles Blackwood's malice. She had never told Jake the full story of Christopher's death, not because she feared his judgment, but because the pain was still too raw. Now she had no choice. Jake needed to hear the truth from her, not as vicious gossip from Charles Blackwood. By the time Jake arrived at the schoolhouse an hour later, as they had arranged, Faith had composed herself outwardly, though anxiety still churned in her stomach. Faith, Jake called as he entered, his smile fading as he saw her expression. What's wrong? Faith rose from her chair. We need to talk, Jake. There's something I should have told you before now. Concern flooded his features as he came to her side. Whatever it is, you can tell me. Faith led him to the student benches where they sat side by side. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. When I told you about Christopher, I didn't tell you everything, she said quietly. Yes, he died of typhoid, but the circumstances, they were more complicated. Jake took her hand, his touch giving her the courage to continue. We had been engaged for nearly a year when I began to realize we weren't well suited, Faith explained. Christopher was a good man, kind and intelligent, but we wanted different things from life. He expected me to give up teaching once we married, to be solely a wife and mother. When I resisted, he grew increasingly controlling, monitoring my activities, questioning my friendships. Jake's hand tightened around hers. You broke the engagement, he guessed. Faith nodded. 2 months before the wedding. Christopher didn't take it well. He begged, threatened, tried to manipulate me into changing my mind. When nothing worked, She swallowed hard. There was a typhoid outbreak in one of the poorest areas of Boston. Christopher was a doctor. He volunteered to treat the victims, despite having no experience with infectious disease. He exposed himself deliberately, Jake said softly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He left me a letter, Faith whispered, tears filling her eyes. He said if he couldn't have me in life, he would ensure I never forgot him in death, that I would carry the guilt of his passing forever. Jake's expression darkened with anger. That wasn't love, Faith. That was cruelty. I know that now, Faith said, but at the time, everyone blamed me. My family, our friends, even my fellow teachers. They said I'd driven him to it with my modern ideas and selfishness. A bitter smile twisted her lips. Boston society has a special talent for making a woman feel responsible for a man's choices. Is that why you came west, to escape the blame? Faith nodded, partly, and partly to find somewhere I could start fresh, somewhere my value wasn't measured solely by my relationship to a man. She looked up at Jake, fear in her eyes. Charles Blackwood knows. He threatened to tell everyone unless I end our engagement and convince you to drop the fight against the mine. Jake's jaw tightened. Blackwood, he growled. I should have known he'd try something like this. Jake, if this becomes public knowledge, then we'll face it together, Jake interrupted firmly. Faith, nothing about your past changes how I feel about you. If anything, it makes me admire your strength even more. Faith searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity. You're not disgusted by what happened with Christopher? The only thing that disgusts me is that a man who claimed to love you would try to control you through guilt, even from the grave, Jake said vehemently, and that others would blame you for his choices. Relief washed over Faith, releasing tears she'd been holding back. Jake gathered her into his arms, holding her close as she cried. As for Blackwood, Jake continued when her tears had subsided, let him do his worst. The truth about the mine is documented, provable. His gossip about your past is just that, gossip. Faith pulled back slightly to look at Jake. You really aren't worried about what people will think? Jake cupped her face gently in his hands. The people who matter will stand by us. The rest, he shrugged. Their opinions aren't worth sacrificing justice or our future together. Faith felt something unwind inside her, a tension she'd carried for so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be without it. I love you, she said simply. Jake smiled, brushing away the last of her tears with his thumb. And I love you. Nothing Charles Blackwood or anyone else says will ever change that. The next morning, Faith walked to the Blackwood Mining Company office, her head held high despite the curious glances from townsfolk. She had dressed with particular care in her best blue dress, her hair neatly arranged, the small diamond ring Jake had given her prominently displayed on her left hand. Charles was waiting for her, a smug expression on his face as his secretary showed her in. Miss McAllister. I trust you've come to your senses. Faith met his gaze steadily. I've come to give you my answer, yes. Charles leaned back in his chair, confidence radiating from every pore. And that answer is, no, Faith said clearly. I will not end my engagement to Jake, nor will I ask him to withdraw his evidence against your family's negligence. Charles's expression darkened. Then you leave me no choice but to— You misunderstand, Mr. Blackwood, Faith interrupted calmly. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to inform you that Jake and I have already spoken to Reverend Thomas this morning. He's agreed to publish a notice in the church newsletter explaining the true circumstances of Christopher's death, along with testimony from several of my former colleagues in Boston who have since recognized the injustice of how I was treated. Charles stared at her, momentarily speechless. Additionally, Faith continued, Jake has already sent copies of all evidence regarding the mine safety violations to the territorial governor and several newspapers in Helena and Denver. Should anything happen to either of us, that information will be published immediately. You're bluffing, Charles said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. I assure you I am not, Faith replied. Now, Mr. Blackwood, you have a choice. You can continue your vendetta against us and watch as your family's reputation is destroyed across the entire territory. Or you can accept that change is coming to the Wallace Creek mine, with or without your cooperation. Charles's face had reddened with anger. You'll regret this, he said, his voice low with threat. Both of you. Faith rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts. I've spent 3 years regretting things beyond my control, Mr. Blackwood. I don't intend to waste any more time on regrets. Good day. She walked out with her head high, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. Outside, Jake was waiting for her, leaning against the hitching post with an outward calm that didn't quite mask the tension in his shoulders. Well, he asked as she approached. Faith smiled, taking his offered arm. I believe Mr. Blackwood is reconsidering his position. Jake's answering smile was fierce with pride. That's my girl. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of wedding preparations and continued negotiations regarding the mine. True to Faith's prediction, the Blackwoods, under pressure from the territorial governor and facing the prospect of damaging newspaper exposés, agreed to implement immediate safety improvements and to compensate the families of all miners killed or injured in accidents over the past 2 years. Charles Blackwood himself left town abruptly, reportedly called back to San Francisco by his father, though rumor had it he'd been removed from his position of authority at the mine. On Saturday morning, Faith stood in Mrs. Wilkins's bedroom at the ranch, the older woman helping her with the final adjustments to her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory satin with lace trim. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Wilkins said, her eyes misty as she secured the last button. "Jake won't know what hit him." Faith smiled nervously, smoothing a hand over the dress. "I can hardly believe this day is finally here. After everything you two have been through these past months, you've earned this happiness," Mrs. Wilkins assured her, adjusting the small wreath of wildflowers in Faith's hair. "There, perfect." A knock at the door announced the arrival of Mr. Peterson, who had offered to escort Faith to the church in the absence of her father. "Miss McAllister, the wagon is ready whenever you are." "Just a moment," Faith called, taking one last look in the mirror. The woman who gazed back at her seemed different from the one who had arrived in Wallace Creek just months ago, stronger, more confident, her eyes bright with hope rather than shadowed by the past. The small church was filled to capacity when Faith arrived, nearly the entire town having turned out for the occasion. Music from the pump organ filled the air as Mr. Peterson led her down the aisle to where Jake waited at the altar, his expression transforming from nervous anticipation to awe as he caught sight of her. He looked more handsome than Faith had ever seen him, dressed in a new black suit, his normally unruly hair tamed for the occasion. But it was the love shining in his eyes that took her breath away. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Thomas began once Faith had reached Jake's side, their hands joining naturally between them. "We are gathered here today." The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, their vows spoken clearly for all to hear, promises of love and fidelity that both intended to keep for a lifetime. When Jake slipped the gold band onto Faith's finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady, his smile radiant. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thomas announced. "Mr. Xavier, you may kiss your bride." Jake needed no further encouragement, drawing Faith into his arms for a kiss that managed to be both proper enough for church and passionate enough to bring a blush to her cheeks. Cheers erupted from the congregation as they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife. The celebration at the ranch lasted well into the evening, with tables set up in the yard under lanterns strung from tree to tree. There was dancing and feasting, laughter and a few happy tears as the community celebrated not just a marriage but the beginning of a new chapter for Wallace Creek itself. As twilight deepened into dusk, Jake found Faith standing apart from the festivities for a moment, gazing up at the stars beginning to appear in the Montana sky. "Happy, Mrs. Xavier?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. Faith leaned into him, savoring the warmth and solidity of his presence. "More than I ever imagined possible," she admitted. "And you, beyond words," Jake said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though I keep expecting to wake up and find this was all a dream." Faith turned in his arms to face him. "Not a dream," she assured him, rising on tiptoes to kiss him softly. "Our reality now and always." Jake smiled down at her, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Do you remember what I said to you that first day during the hailstorm?" Faith nodded, the memory vivid despite all that had happened since. "You said under my hat we'll make it home." "And we have," Jake said softly, gesturing to the ranch around them, to the community gathered to celebrate their union. "This is our home, Faith, together." As another dance began and their guests called for the bride and groom to join in, Faith took Jake's hand, her heart full to overflowing with love and gratitude. The journey that had brought her to this moment had been filled with unexpected turns, hailstorms and bloodied knuckles, threats and revelations, courage and faith rewarded. Together, she agreed, following him back to the celebration, secure in the knowledge that whatever storms life might still hold, they would weather them as they had the first, side by side, finding their way home to each other.